Work going on right now. Ah, thank you. We're going to record this session today. And so thanks for joining us for this input session. As I was saying, the Vermont Climate Council is updating its climate action plan. And there's a lot of work going on in its subcommittees and the task groups in the subcommittees in trying to look at what content needs to be carried forward, what new content needs to happen in an updated climate action plan. Today's session is focused on what you see on the screen, buildings and the thermal issues. We're doing other input sessions, and we can drop some links in the chat later about those other input sessions that'll happen later this month and into next. Before we get going on the content of today, I think it's in these Zoom meetings, it's helpful to do just a couple things to see who's here. We're going to do it two ways. First, I encourage you to drop in the chat where you're dialing in from or where you're zooming in from today. So feel free in the chat just to drop in where you're coming from. And if you want to put any affiliation that you have, like who you work with, that's great too. But I'm just interested to see where in the state of Vermont or outside the state of Vermont, folks are dialing in from today. So feel free to do that in the chat. And you should have ability to do that. Yep, Dwight kicked it off. Thanks, Dwight. And you'll see that go through. So that's one thing, and it's helpful to take a look at that and see the diversity of where we're calling in from. The other thing we're going to do quick before we get going, and my colleague Charlotte can go ahead and start this. This is a one-question Zoom poll. It's sort of what's your connection here to climate change in the building sector? And this is a little bit related to affiliation, but if you just take a second to answer this question, you can see the variety of options. Maybe some don't fit for you, so go ahead and say other. But it's just helpful to know who's in the room. So just take a moment. Thanks for those of you who have answered. We've got a majority of folks who've already clicked an answer, but I'll give you the rest of you a second to finish up. And we'll show those responses. All right, Charlotte, let's give you just one more second here, and then we can go ahead and... All right, why don't we go ahead and show those responses? And it's helpful to see. You should be able to see this on your screen, folks. And it's nice to see a variety of sort of different reasons why you're here, whether you're in the private sector or business folks, civil society, advocacy, government folks, interested citizen, someone who works with our utilities in Vermont, et cetera. And the others. If there's others that you really want to mention that you didn't put it in the chat already, feel free to do that. Okay, so we've got interesting folks in the room. Let's dive into the conversation. I'm going to turn it over to the folks from the subcommittee and the task group that's been working on all this work. They're going to do a presentation that's probably going to last about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more. Let's see how it goes. And then we're going to use the rest of our time to have a discussion about that, meaning opportunities to provide some input, opportunities to ask some questions. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we'll do that when we get to that part of the agenda today. We'll be finishing up by 2 o'clock. And thanks everybody for your time. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm not sure who's going to kick it off. Dave, is that you? Okay, great. Let me turn it over to Dave Farnsworth. And Dave, go ahead and introduce yourself. And why don't you kick off the presentation?
Great, David. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're great.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Dave Farnsworth with the Regulatory Assistance Project. You know, in 2020, the Vermont legislature, like a lot of other jurisdictions around the world, determined that Vermont needs to reduce its emissions, and in line with Kyoto, in line with the Paris Agreement. And so that year they passed the Global Warming Solutions Act. It became law, and it sets out emission reduction goals for the state and a timeline for the state to follow to meet those goals. Another key point here, it's really important to remember that our economy is very carbon intensive. In 2022 alone, Vermont spent about $2.5 billion, that's with a B, $billion on fossil fuels. And of all that spending, about $2 billion of it went out of state. So not surprisingly, the solutions we're looking for, finding the solutions, these have to be solutions that work for and will strengthen Vermont's economy and bring it into the 21st century like it needs to be. So the Global Warming Solutions Act also sets out obligations for the Vermont Climate Council, which include having to identify, analyze, and evaluate strategies and programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to achieve the state's reduction requirements. The Climate Council has various subcommittees. One of them is called the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee. That subcommittee has work groups, and one of them is called the Buildings Thermal Task Group. And if I can advance these slides, there you go. Okay. So the Building Thermal Task Groups comprise of these people, some of whom you're going to be hearing from today. Our process works like this. We identify pathways, and those are really high-level approaches, and then strategies under each of those pathways. And those are more specific, they're measurable, they're groups of approaches. And then thirdly, we identify actions, and those are policies, programs, initiatives, what have you, to get at the emissions in this part of the economy. So we're doing this in 4 different contexts. As you can see here, we're focusing on buildings, we're focusing on equipment, and we're focusing on fuels. And then there is a 4th context, I call it. It's cross-cutting. So it's a term we use to describe shared contexts that we have with other groups. For example, we might be looking at the need for rate design to support demand response with respect to water heaters, but that's something that the electricity task group might be working on. So there are these cross-cutting issues that we deal with. And basically that's the context and that's the approach that this group has been working with. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand this off to Sam Lash, and she's going to provide a bit more background and then start talking with you about buildings. Okay, Sam, the mic's yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, all. I'm Sam Lash, she, hers, Climate and Energy Planner at Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. I think today really our focus is reviewing very briefly our pathway strategies and actions that we've drafted thus far as a working group, and really trying to leave as much time as possible for discussion and comments and feedback. So I think we could all agree we could have an hour-and-a-half discussion on any one of the things that are likely to come up today. In light of that, there are more detailed slides available and lots of other introductory materials that have been presented at various meetings that if you are sort of like, I'd really like that over a higher level view, reach out to any one of us and we can point you in the direction. Today, we're assuming a relative sort of comfort and knowledge base in this sphere. But really quickly, just to, set the table, where are we? Just a really quick reminder that we're talking really about the thermal sector, so mostly building and water heating, space and water heating. It's about 44% of our energy use across the state, 31% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and, about 35% of energy expenditures in terms of cost. So just thinking about the chunk that we're addressing with these pathway strategies and actions. Right now, currently, approximately a quarter of that energy use is renewable based on Vermont state statutes definition. And then just really briefly to show you this overall curve of where we are. So you can see halfway through this graph right here is sort of right where we are. It says 2021 approximately. And then this downward trend is what we're trying to achieve with the pathway strategies and actions that we'll be talking about today. So this is not the model of where we're going based if we just keep status quo. This is the line that we need to achieve with the pathway strategies and actions that we're talking today. Pretty obvious probably, but just want to sort of orient us to what our mission is here. And we don't only want to do this, we want to do this justly, right? That's a big piece of this and a big piece we try not to let fall off the table throughout our conversations. Next slide, please. And a really, really quick of, what has been going on. Obviously, there's been a ton of uptake in a lot of these recommendations already. Really briefly, thanks, shout out to the EAN annual progress report for most of these graphics. And again, for an understanding of the data behind these and our progress on other sectors, please do see that report. But, really quickly on the left here, you see our residential heat pump water heaters, our housing units that have been comprehensively weatherized, and our residential cold climate heat pump uptake over the past few years, which you can see is, really increasing. And that is, no small part due to all of the efforts, including a lot of the work that we'll be noting about continuing or expanding or building on today. But despite all of that work and quite a lot of investment across the state, these bars show us that we are only a fraction away of making our targets for 2030. And then we also have additional targets through 2050. So we know that the pace and scale is still a steep curve for us. We know there's a huge amount of work that's being done on weatherization. I hope you see that reflected in the updated pathway strategies and actions. There are a lot of different task groups and working groups and wonderful stakeholder conversations, many of which myself and other folks in the working group have been able to be a part of. And a lot of these are focused on identifying barriers and funding gaps. So again, in the next slide, when we get into it, we hope that you'll see some of that work, and also really looking forward to having conversations if there are things that we missed or could expand upon. Just a note here, and something that's often less in figures, is that there is a lot of ongoing work in the commercial and industrial sectors as well in terms of thermal. For example, I will just speak for Central Vermont because I know those numbers better, but the past 4 years or so, we have 7 to 950-ish commercial industrial projects annually coming out of Efficiency Vermont in our region. 50 to 150 or so cold climate heat pumps annually installed, far fewer heat pump water heaters installed. And so just to give you an idea, that is awesome and an amazing progress. We know that our targets are significantly more than that, about a third more, 3 times that annually that we would be needing to achieve to reach our GWSA targets. So basically it's, keep on keeping on, but also where should we be optimizing, who's getting left out, and how do we really seriously, put our nose to the grind. Just a few mentions that obviously with our residential building energy standards and commercial building energy standards, there are updates every 3 years. That's to be in compliance with the International Energy Conservation Code. So our last, update from the 2020 was this past July 2024, and there are also, in 2023 and then again in 2024, acts of legislation that have included a building energy study committee and reports. So there's a lot of ongoing work in this space as well, which we'll touch on. Same goes for these other areas as well, and we'll get into that as we go on. I'm conscious of time. I guess maybe we'll save questions, but please don't hesitate to write them in the chat, and I'll try to pay attention. So today, basically the rest of the presentation is really a quick review of our pathway strategy, proposed drafted pathway strategies and actions. So I'll just do buildings and then I'll pass it off. But really weatherization is a key precursor to fuel switching. It's a key for conservation of electricity and emissions reduction strategy. It also has really significant health and financial benefits for individuals, our communities, our businesses, and the state. And so, really, hopefully a no-brainer, and one and a place that we've been putting a lot of work across the state in over the past many years. So the pathway is really about reducing greenhouse gas emissions via weatherization and energy efficiency improvements, as well as through energy and electrical standards and codes. Now, the strategy 1 will be focused on the weatherization and that's really on the retrofitting of our buildings and facilities. And then we'll talk about strategy 2 in the next slide, which is really focused more towards new construction. So the strategy
Can I just interrupt for 1 second? Yeah, because I think slides need to go forward. Here we go. This was the slide you were just on, right?
I am on currently.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. So sorry. Yeah. Thanks for that. Apologies if you if we were lagged, and happy to explain figures at any time if we need to go back at any point in here. So yeah, so this is our first pathway. Our strategy is really about ramping up existing multi-year weatherization at scale initiatives. This is residential and commercial, and remember, in commercial, it's also municipal and public as well. This is about making sure that we're meeting what's needed in our communities, as well as what's necessary to meet our 2030 Global Warming Solution Act requirements. We really focus in our actions, and these are abbreviated versions here with the extended versions in the slides that hopefully made it around, and hopefully we can add a link or follow up with a link to those extended slides, but really focused our actions on meeting our weatherization goals across all sectors, eliminating barriers to weatherization in low and moderate income homes. So really heard loud and clear that there is a mismatch in funding in terms of demand and eligibility, that funding clocks are a struggle, and there are some key stopgaps, but also some sharp drop-offs, especially after 2026. And that really there's a bunch of barriers in this weatherization ready bucket that really affect low and moderate income folks, also older homes, but also renters, mobile and manufactured folks who live in mobile and manufactured homes, as well as folks who are aging in place. So really tried to flesh out several actions here that address that specifically. And then the last is really to secure funding to weatherize municipal and public buildings. So we've had some really successful programs in the past few years. There's a huge demand for it. We saw most recently with the Municipal Energy Resilience Grant Program, over 200 municipalities applied, and we had 200 implementation applications after the energy audit. So that's a pretty big need, and a great batch of projects among other programs. I don't want to go too far into the specific language of the actions, but we can certainly revisit during a discussion. So next slide, please. All right. And our second strategy under this sort of first pathway, which is really focused on buildings and facilities, is to strengthen our statewide building energy standards and fund education and enforcement necessary to meet 2030 and 2050 Global Warming Solution Act requirements. So this is definitely, the first one was focused more on retrofitting, and this one's definitely more geared towards new construction, with an eye towards, obviously, the intersection with sort of the housing crisis or housing shortage, and also making sure that we're not locking folks into systems that are going to end up costing them longer in the long run, but also making sure that we're cognizant of upfront costs and how to, optimally balance that. So the actions focus on regularly updating residential building energy standards and the commercial building energy standards, which is done, as I said, every 3 years. Develop and sustainably fund potentially an energy code circuit rider initiative, and that's one that's currently funded for a year or two. But thinking about what would that take for that assistance and training to persist beyond that pilot period. And then there's been a lot of discussion around the Act 47 Building Energy Code Study and a series of recommendations that came out for it. And we do have the extended language that we can pull up for discussion, but really this is focused on a series of actions that would include designating authority to the Division of Fire Safety as a statewide authority. And I know there's a lot of discussion that's been had and a lot of current ongoing discussion here. So I don't think I'll get too much into it and let it come up in discussion if that's all right. But, something that we're very cognizant of, and we have, thus far included it as an action with much discussion amongst our working group with a lot of different perspectives amongst us as well. So, something to flag there. And, I will pass it off to, I believe, Jared to talk about equipment.
Thanks, Sam, and good afternoon, everybody. Really glad to be with you. My name is Jared Duval. I'm appointed to the Vermont Climate Council to provide expertise in energy data and analysis. I'm going to be going over our second pathway, which is really focused on equipment. So in the first climate action plan that was adopted about 3 years ago, there were really two main pathways. One was around buildings and how we make them more efficient, including their shells and weatherization, and one was on fuels, and how we lower the greenhouse gas emissions from the heating fuels that we use in the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel sector. But there was this working group, this task group thought, a missing opportunity to focus specifically on equipment and what can be done to help make equipment more efficient, lower emitting, and less costly for Vermonters. This mirrors some of the strategies and actions that were in the first climate action plan with respect to transportation. So folks are may be familiar that the first climate action plan recommended and then rules were adopted for Vermont to join with California and other states around the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule, which is going to require manufacturers to deliver an increasing share of zero emissions vehicles to Vermont. And so the question that we're looking at is what can be done through similar performance standards on the equipment side to ensure that new equipment sold in Vermont, where there is the technological capability to do it, meets a low or a no greenhouse gas emissions standard so that we're not locking in decades more of climate pollution when we don't have to, and when we're not locking in Vermont consumers to decades more of reliance on what are generally high cost and price volatile fuels, especially when we look at things like fuel oil and propane. So this first, when we look at the equipment pathway, we're looking at the possibility of zero or low greenhouse gas emission standards. Many states are looking at this, and we expect model rules to be coming from other states very shortly. So we're looking at perhaps joining them. There are many states that already pursue a low NOx standard for water heating equipment. So we're looking at NOx-based standards in addition to greenhouse gas emissions-based standards for water and space heating equipment. And then also working to look at what can be done to ensure that low global warming potential refrigerants are used in heat pumps that are sold in Vermont. So those are a few of the strategies we're looking at in the equipment pathway. Next slide, please. We also want to make sure that as beneficial electrification, the efficient use of modern electric technology for space and water heating happens, that it happens in an equitable and cost-effective way to benefit low and moderate income households in Vermont as much as possible. So some of the actions that we're looking at there involve sustainable funding sources, recognizing that often low and moderate income households require a full grant or a very high incentive to adopt these technologies, which, while they often save money and cut pollution over time, can face higher upfront investment costs. And then we're also looking at consumer protection in terms of as more and more is electrified, ensuring that folks have access to that space and water heating and are protected from things like service disconnections and not having problems with state fuel assistance support. Happy to get into more specifics around that later. But for now, in the interest of time, next slide. This is kind of a continuation of the last one, but one of the things that we want to make sure that happens is that when water heaters are sold in Vermont, when new water heater models are sold, they have the ability to communicate with to have controls so that there can be avoiding the most polluting peak periods of electricity demand. So we're looking at an action around open communication standard to ensure that new water heaters are capable of load management, where a customer or a utility, if the customer allows, could reduce the demand of the water heater at the periods of peak demand when electricity is most expensive and most polluting. Next slide. And then we're also looking at, this is connected to the last one, especially around water heating loads, and mirroring some work that the Public Utility Commission has already done when it comes to rules around EV charging, but working to make sure that distribution utilities adopt water heater demand response programs, and work with the PUC around that. Next, and I think that may be my last slide, and am ready to pass it over to Alec.
I think I'll be taking this one, Jared.
Oh, Ben, sorry.
Yep, no worries. I'm Ben Belaski. I'm a thermal energy program specialist at the Department of Public Service. Yeah, so this brings us to fuels. Obviously, when talking about thermal energy policy, fuels is really central to consider. And so Pathway 4 really gets at ensuring that the fuels that are used in our thermal equipment around the state, as we transition to an electrified, decarbonized thermal sector, we want to ensure that the existing fossil fuel fired equipment that is still in use is using a more basically a cleaner fuel that has a lower greenhouse gas intensity. And our strategy here is to implement the Clean Heat Standard. That is obviously a larger, multifaceted approach to the thermal sector, but embedded within the Clean Heat Standard is a declining carbon intensity score requirement for fuels that are used in the thermal sector. And so that is the current policy proposal on the table now. So that is our strategy for the fuel sector. And again, that embedded within the Clean Heat Standard is that declining carbon intensity score requirement that would get us by 2050 to a point that is have fuels that are a CI score of about below 20 by 2050. And then that brings us, jumping from fuels to cross-cutting to Pathway 5. And this really is specifically about workforce. Obviously, a huge issue when thinking about not only the thermal sector, but really all sectors, included within the climate action plan. Workforce is a massive issue in Vermont. And so related directly to the thermal sector, our action here is to really continue toward and complete the development of the workforce or the Weatherization Workforce Training Center, which would assist greatly in ramping up our weatherization workforce, which we desperately need to really increase the amount of homes and businesses that are weatherized around the state. So Pathway 5 directly related to the workforce in that cross-cutting area. And next slide, please. Pathway 6, or cross-cutting. This gets at basically ensuring that, as we work both in the thermal sector and across all sectors, work towards meeting our GWSA targets that we've laid out as a state, gets at basically the energy efficiency utilities, ensuring that the metrics that those entities are using have basically greenhouse gas emissions reductions and energy burden reductions built into their metrics, so that we can more accurately track progress towards the Global Warming Solutions Act, and it becomes more central to the progress and the metrics that those entities are using, so that it's essentially embedded in the work that they are doing to ensure that we hit our targets. So I think that's what I've got there. I'm passing it back to Dave, I believe.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Ben. Thanks, Jared, Sam. As you folks can see, we have a list of additional topics here. I'm not going to go into in huge detail, but you seem to be determined on a number of slides here where this is a work in progress. And we're undertaking discussions and trying to figure out what are going to be the best collection of responses that get at meeting the goals that are set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And not surprising, there are industrial issues like waste heat recovery, ground source heat pumps we haven't gotten into in a great deal of detail, but those are promising. The alternative strategies, if clean heat standards not passed, then what portfolio of strategies is going to produce the results that an overarching policy like clean heat standard could produce if that's not passed? There are other utility related things. Bill assistance is very important. Getting things not just for state scale, but for community scale, and recognizing those needs, and the implications for land use are always really important in Vermont. So there are lots of things going on, lots of things underway. These discussions are occurring. This group has met 14 times, I think, and we continue our work. And what I'm going to do is first thank you for your attention, and then pass it back to David. Can I bail out of these slides, David?
Yeah, we can drop the slides. Yeah, let's do that.
Thank
We
you.
can always bring them back up too. So this is the opportunity for us to have some conversation about this. There's 70 of us on the call right now. So I guess the ground rules I'd like to put on for today's conversation is share the floor. We may have a number of us who want to make some comments or ask some questions. And also be ready to be respectful of people who think differently than you do on these issues. These are tough issues, some of them. How do you fund them? How do you make it work? And so let's be respectful of different views. All right, with that said, this group is looking for input. They have not finished their recommendations. Their recommendations are still under development. The subcommittee is going to look at them, and then they get put up to the council as recommendations in December. The Climate Council is going to look at them and deliberate over the winter. So these are not done yet. And so it's an opportunity to provide some input, to ask some questions. So since we're on Zoom, probably the best way is that raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your screen if you're not a frequent Zoom user. We encourage you to click on that and get in the queue to ask a question or make a comment. And we can pull those slides up whenever we need to. In fact, there's even more detailed slides at the bottom of that deck that have a little bit more information in them. And then, of course, those questions that Dave Farnsworth left us with are interesting questions for us to dive into. But let's see how it goes initially. Brad, I see your hands up. Thanks so much. Jump on in.
Okay, I maybe just quickly, I'll go through a bunch of comments I have as you went along on the different topics. I was a home performance weatherization contractor for over a decade and a half up until COVID hit us. And I have been trying to help other clients since then to weatherize their homes. And one of the problems with weatherization workforce is there are fewer workers. When I was I'd say just before COVID, there were over 90 contractors listed as doing weatherization on the Business Vermont website. Today, there are less than half of that. Today, of the 44 or 45 that are listed on their website, 3 of them do nothing but energy audits, which it didn't used to be. We used to have maybe 1. They really discouraged it. Several of them, I can guarantee at least 6 of those contractors don't do the work themselves. They sub everything out. Several others do some of the work, but sub out all of the energy assessments. So they don't really, it's not a continuous who's looking at what's getting done and is it getting done right. The concern with, I've also been working with Resource. I developed and have run several weatherization training courses particularly aimed at their low-income clientele. And my concern with weatherization training is, one, the proposed center is going to be located in one spot in the state, which is going to be very inconvenient for a lot of people to get to, particularly people that have transportation problems. And the second is, that's all addressing workers, but what about the companies? As I just pointed out, there are maybe 36 companies, maybe, that are doing weatherization in the entire state. And actually, several of those are from New Hampshire and New York. They are actually live in New Hampshire or New York. So not just weatherization, we need companies developed to start doing the weatherization. One of your earlier graphs was weatherization graph on what has been comprehensively weatherized, and yeah, it shows an increase every year. They are no longer doing comprehensive weatherization, except in the low-income weatherization program. A lot of the contractors working with Efficiency Vermont are now doing only the low-hanging fruit. I have I've been in touch with and communicated with several of the contractors, including several that I used to work with, my former colleagues. And that's what they're doing now. There's this big push to cover so many clients that want to get weatherization with these huge incentives that they're just going for low-hanging fruit. So it's not comprehensive anymore. A lot of these contractors, if you have a flat attic with fiberglass, they'll rip it all out and throw it away, skim it with a 2-part spray foam, and fill it up with cellulose. If you have a knee wall with fiberglass that's not covered, they rip it out and spray foam it, and that's it. RBS, CBES. So actually, this has been mentioned a couple of times. The present standards, the latest one came into effect in this past summer in July, is getting more and more strict. Number one, there is not adequate training for RBs, because another hat that I wore for many years is doing progress inspections for a company that managed construction loans. And I saw a lot of new construction in the last 20 years. And they continue to build new homes. A lot of builders are not really paying attention to the code, and those that are filling it out, but not really looking at the intent, and no one's really following up on it.
Hey, Brad, I'm just going to jump in for 1 second because I got a whole bunch of folks with their hands up, and I want to say this is really useful. And if there's something else short you want to say that really drives to how this group might adapt what it's doing, that might be great. And I want to make sure I leave time for others to make some comments too.
Yeah, so wrap it up. Turn it off, turn it down is the #1 way to save energy. I think there should be more education to the public to do that and the benefits. There should be more education to the public on why should Vermont do this? We're one of the smallest states in the whole country. What effect are we going to have? If everybody has that attitude, California is much bigger than us. We're going to get nowhere. I would concentrate more on the existing homes that have huge amounts of heat loss and pay less attention to keep updating the RBs and the codes and the standards. Right now, they're very strict. They're saving a ton of energy. If you make them even more restrictive, fewer people are going to follow them all, just going to create more problems, and you're not getting enough done. And I have more to say, but I'll say it later. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. I really appreciate all that input. Okay, great. So a lot of thoughts around weatherization, around code, around education. Okay. Guy Payne, you're up next. You're on mute, Guy. And again, you can see there's a lot of hands up, so we're going to have to try to be efficient in our comments.
I can do this quickly.
Yeah.
First of all, I agree with with Brad. A lot of what he was saying is what I think. In terms of strategy, under building strategy 2, under the action plan, the 4th bullet, I would really encourage the home builders sort of coalition has advanced a number of programs for certification through OPR. I would encourage this plan to have it so that those assessments of those training programs have been complete. A lot of it has to do with building science, the energy code, and we would encourage OPR, and I realize the pressure they are under to complete those assessments. That would be great, because we need the incentives for people to continue with their learning. With refrigerants, equipment strategy 3, I just want to make sure that there's not unintended consequences if we're changing refrigerants. Are we increasing do we have to add new ductwork? Are we adding new sensors for safety? And what is this going to do to the cost of some of the work? So I am sure folks are looking at it, but I want to make sure that there are not unintended consequences, that people who have already have heat pumps in, that now they're not burdened with additional costs. The last part, cross-cutting pathways. I would encourage that we have and actually working with resource that the state approves and delivers a registered apprenticeship program for carpenters / high-performance builder, not just a registered apprenticeship program for carpenters, because our new generation needs to understand water vapor management. And so that has to be part, as well as the energy code. That's got to be part of the apprenticeship program, as well as really a grant funding in or foundation in building science.
Thanks,
so that would be my comments.
Thanks, Guy. I really appreciate those comments. Yeah. Jess Newbelt, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this meeting and for all the comments already. I agree with them. I'm at this meeting as someone wearing a hat as a homeowner who's done some upgrades through using Efficiency Vermont funding, and also I am a developer at an affordable housing organization that owns and operates buildings, so kind of residential, commercial. Long story short, I think I would say I agree with what Brad said about focusing on existing housing stock as much as possible. I agree that RB's, CB's 2024 are quite stringent. The buildings we build now are extremely tight, air sealing, largely electrified, doing way, 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 way better than the existing housing stock, and it's very hard to retrofit the existing housing stock. I would also encourage, for same reason, a focus. I think you have a question here about focusing on incentives versus regulations, and I think making incentives more broadly available for retrofits, which are largely going to be optional. Well, I guess unless you regulate them, but I think incentives for retrofits, and in particular low barriers to those incentives. One of the things that makes Efficiency Vermont's incentives so great is that there's not a lot of paperwork, not a big administrative burden. The contractor sends paperwork off, you get your check back in the mail a few weeks later. Like, it is extremely simple to access. Means testing, while appealing, also I think gets in the way of adoption. And two other pretty minor comments. Not surprised to see that the hot water heating uptake has been a lot less. Heat pump hot water heaters, just particularly in the commercial or multifamily context, are really hard to use because you don't have a lot of waste heat to take advantage of. So if you're trying to have centralized hot water heating, you've got a freezing mechanical room. Another reason why I think incentive over regulation, particularly for domestic hot water heating, might be the way to go. And then last comment gets to a little bit what the gentleman before me was saying. Workforce training around refrigerants. I think we've been installing heat pumps and are now seeing a lot of need for refrigerant, re-upping the refrigerant in our systems, which is concerning because those are obviously big greenhouse gases. And as we're shifting to refrigerants with lower greenhouse gas or lower carbon footprints, may be less of an issue. But I think making sure that the workforce dealing with refrigerants knows what they're doing. We have leak-proof systems is really important. Otherwise, what's the point of electrification? You're just releasing other greenhouse gases. All right, thank you all.
Thanks, Jess. Appreciate those comments. Mia Watson, you're up next.
Thanks. I'm Mia Watson, Vermont Housing Finance Agency. I think Jared maybe answered my question in the chat, but I was just curious. One of my comments was about the new thermal equipment. And when Jared says new installations, do you mean installations in a new building, or are we talking about a scenario where the boiler dies and it needs to be like in an existing home and it needs to be replaced with an electric model instead of a gas-fueled one?
If it's okay to directly respond quickly.
Yeah.
In the task group, we've recognized that as we've reviewed what other states are doing, oftentimes it really matters, a focus. Different things are possible in residential versus commercial, different equipment types, boilers, furnaces, etc. So the short answer to your question is we're looking at new equipment. So it would include, if in an existing home, if an old water heater dies, applying that performance standard to anything new that might replace it. But the standards wouldn't apply to existing equipment in homes and buildings. But there will need to be important conversations around exemptions based on technical and economic feasibility. So we're not talking about across the board standards, but standards broadly for new equipment when the technology allows to meet a lower and no emissions standard, so that we can avoid locking in emissions and costs for decades to come.
Thanks. And I guess I just respond that I think that needs to be done really carefully and thoughtfully. I don't know how, from a regulatory approach, you sort of easily make a decision about a household's capacity to install fossil fuel-free versions. Some homes in our existing aging housing stock have pretty significant problems, either with layout or other issues like vermiculite and electrical limitations. And I just worry about sort of the possibility of a heavy-handed approach that puts a homeowner or a property owner in a position where they have to make thousands and thousands of dollars in upgrades in order to keep their home heated when their existing equipment dies. So I would just urge sensitivity in general, and then also think about any solutions being paired with sort of significant resources for home repairs that will allow people to do the enabling upgrades that are necessary to get this work in our existing stock. Thanks.
Thanks, Mia. Thanks for those comments. Debbie, you're up next.
Thank you. Debbie New with Vermont Community Thermal Networks. I just want to recognize from the chat the people who mentioned ground source heat pumps, and talk a little bit about how some of us are, including people on this call, are working to implement those in Vermont. They are highly efficient, but they're also highly inaccessible for most Vermonters, having to do with the geothermal drilling costs, et cetera, and really almost impossible for individual homeowners, except for wealthy people, to be able to take advantage of that technology. I'm really glad that waste heat recovery and community solutions are on your list, and I look forward to hearing about that conversation, what comes out of that, because we really need this solution of ground source heat pumps to be shared infrastructure that people can simply connect to, rather than to have to shoulder the upfront costs themselves. Our municipalities can do this now. We have a new law that allows that. What we need is to help the volunteers and the town officials that have limited capacity, who are trying to explore the solution. We need to enable them by having more state support. And I've spoken with the state treasurer about climate infrastructure financing, not just the money, but what kind of support is needed to make sure the money is implemented well and effectively. So I'm interested in state support solutions for this. I know other states have various ways of making sure thermal energy networks are fully explored. And I also want to say that pairing this solution with community solar and with electric ratepayer protection, which I'm glad to see reference to that, will put us a long way toward achieving our climate goals. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Jean, you're up next.
Hi, Jean Terwilliger with the Energy Navigator program of the Climate Economy Action Center of Addison County. have been doing a lot of dozens of energy coaching visits in the last 6 months. And so my comments reflect our experience, that what we've been seeing there. So I second Mia Watson's need to comment about needing to take a comprehensive approach, because homeowners definitely don't necessarily know what they're getting themselves into, and they talk to individual contractors, and until they've got an energy audit and a plan, it's really hard to understand what the building needs, and they're all different. The other big thing I'd like to emphasize is that we've seen a lot of missed opportunities. People who have had a equipment failure and needed to replace something, and the contractors are not recommending upgrading equipment. They are, I think one of the reasons that heat pump hot water heaters have not had a larger uptake is because of lack of knowledge from contractors, or one bad experience, which basically makes them say, oh, we're not going to do this anymore, and we're not going to recommend it. And what we've seen is that many contractors are simply putting in whatever they've got on hand rather than looking at updating. So how do we reach out and do contractor training to people who don't already attend the Better Buildings Conference and things like that? Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Dwight?
Yeah, and I have quite a list here, so if I get too lengthy, just tell me to shut up. But
Give you the hook?
Yeah. So I'm Dwight DeCoster. I'm the director of the Weatherization Assistance Program for CVO. Sorry, I was holding my space bar down to unmute myself, and that wasn't working for me. So I have, like I said, in our experience, I've been doing this for 9 years. And it's absolutely critical. Our clientele are on the edge as it is, that none of this can cost them any more in their energy benefit, we've talking about just slight increases or on one side and massive increases on the other side. But it cannot cost our homeowners anymore, because this huge segment of Vermont population is living in that level, and they just simply don't have the money to do any of this work on their own. Done several grants pilots and grants over the year where we tried to connect low-income homeowners with various low-interest loans, and we find that segment of the population is very debt averse. They are not willing to take on any more debt. So that's one thing. Fuel assistance, I was glad to see that was noted on this. Fuel assistance is all mostly federal, and at the rules that are currently put out there, fuel assistance can only be used for one fuel source. So our client, if they move to partially electric or whatever, or when they use fossil fuels, they're only going to get fuel assistance for one of those fuels. So those rules, as we move forward, those rules need to be changed at the federal level. Jeff Wilcox is always reminding me that fuel assistance is not meant to cover the entire cost, but it does cover quite a bit for them. Technology, and our folks that live in mobile homes, I want to talk about that. Significant population of our folks work in mobile homes. And the technology is very difficult. We talked about heat pump hot water heaters. They do not work well in mobile homes. Somebody mentioned that they cool the space off. The only place we can put those a lot of times is in bedrooms, in the master bedroom, and that has not been a successful technology in that situation. They require much more maintenance and cleaning and understanding of the technology that I don't say this in a negative way, that our clients they're spending so much of their headspace and timing on surviving that they don't have the headspace and timing for remember to maintain cold climate heat pumps and heat pump hot water heaters. So yeah, there's that. And then the specifics of the way the mobile homes are designed, wastewater and supply water, heat pump technology is not conducive to that sort of thing. So I was just in a home yesterday. Some of you may have seen our spot. We were up in Isle of Mott with Senator Welch on that, and that homeowner, they have their cold climate, their heat pump hot water heater is in a bedroom, and they absolutely detest it and hate it. And they said that we wish we'd never let you put it in because it cools that area off so much. So I think that's one of the things we need to understand is proper placement. And not every home is conducive to the technology as it stands. So that's all I got.
That's great. Thanks so much, Dwight. It's really great experience. Mike Roy, you're up next.
Hi, thanks. Mike Roy. I live in Middlebury. I work with Jean Terwilliger on this Energy Navigators program. And I guess I just build on her comments to say that many states are working on these kind of neighbor-to-neighbor energy coaching programs and kind of hyper-local, just telling the story, normalizing this new behavior, getting people to hear the stories of their neighbors and learning from their neighbors. And so I just think in terms of a lot of what I've heard today is about policy and technology and finance, but I think there's also a dimension of education, outreach, storytelling, normalization. Most people want to do something and they just need it helps as more and more people kind of document the progress that they're making. So I didn't see anything in your recommendations around that kind of hyper local just storytelling and documentation. And so I feel like that might be a piece that will help build out. You need all of the finance, you need the workforce development, you need the policy, you need the technology, but you also need that last layer, which I think is hyper important as well.
Thanks, Mike.
And I put the link to our website in the chat if anybody wants to learn more about it. So we're doing a pilot of this in Addison County. We did not put Addison County in the name, thinking that maybe someday it might want to. We're not ready to do it yet, but it might want to grow up and be a Vermont-wide thing. And so just thinking about should we have some Vermont-based network of local energy coaches to help build on the great work that places like Energy Efficiency Vermont and CVOEO are already doing.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah. David Westman, you're up next.
Hi, David. Yeah, Dave Westman for Efficiency Vermont. A lot of you probably work with other colleagues of mine in this space, Kelly Lucci, Juliana Bortz, Jay Pilliard. We've got a large team that works on this. So I'm here to just reflect on some of these recommendations that we're seeing through this presentation. And I think that for every one of these slides, we could probably put together pretty lengthy responses and thoughts. And so I'm not going to do that here, erring on the side of perhaps thinking more about filing some written comments. Also an opportunity for us to coordinate with some of our partners, some of which are on this call, and how we might respond to those. What I wanted to just impress on the committee and the subcommittee that's working on these is that what this space in particular needs most is a customer-centric approach, something that is catered to the individual needs of the household. We just heard an example of how from Mr. DeCoster, or I believe someone that a heat pump in the bed or heat pump water heater in the bedroom is not great for that customer. And I think that is a really important proof point. We've made comments like that in the rollout of some of these programs. We need a customer focused, contractor focused approach to a lot of these policies. And so, the more constraints we put on them, the more requirements, the more policies, the more silos that are put in this sector, it becomes harder and harder for implementers and administrators like Efficiency Vermont to actually navigate and create programs that are customer focused and contractor friendly and capable of delivering both the financial assistance as well as the projects that we all agree that we need. So that's kind of the nature of my comment now is, we need to think about these policies in the context of who's actually getting them installed in their homes, who's installing them in the market, what kind of signals these send to the market, and thinking about those appropriately.
Thanks, David. That's great. Now, as we've been having these verbal comments, there's been a ton of stuff in the chat. So I'll just note that. And, folks who've been putting things in the chat, I'd welcome if there's things that haven't been said or you need to say them verbally, please do. I noticed, Rich Cohort, go ahead. And then I noticed that Melissa, you had wanted us to talk a little bit about a funding question, but Rich, go ahead, and then I'll go grab some other things in the chat.
I simply wanted to make sure that we're going to preserve the chat. There's a lot of good comments in there.
Yeah, I've actually been sorting them as we go also to get a good highlight of where there's been like particular focus and energy too. So we'll definitely preserve this.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll make sure Sam, you and others get the file as well, the full file. Okay. So yeah, there's been a lot of comments in the chat. Thanks everyone for that. We will preserve that. I think I'm a little slow scrolling through, but I have this feeling that Melissa Bailey, you said, oh, let's have a conversation about the funding question. Melissa, can you say a little bit about what exactly you'd like to spark in terms of conversation right now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And Melissa Bailey with the Public Service Department. I co-chair the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, along with Rich, who just spoke up, and buildings and thermal is one component of what our subcommittee is looking at. We have a really robust set of potential recommendations here for program improvements and policies and services for Vermonters to help them address GHG emissions in the thermal sector. With an eye towards reducing costs as well. I'm just going to pose to the group the really tough question that we're going to need to grapple with as a subcommittee, and that the legislature next session will also need to grapple with, which is really what funding sources should or shouldn't be considered as we look towards implementing all of these recommendations, right? All of these come with a price tag, whether it be big or small. And I'd just love to have the group's thoughts on recommendations where we can identify a potential funding source.
Great. So that's a question for all of us. We got 68 of us on the call. Feel free if someone wants to jump in on Melissa's question. Lou, go ahead, please. Lou, you're going to have to unmute yourself. There you go.
I just did it. Sorry to be slow.
You're good.
We've spent a lot of time in the subject of solar. I don't believe has even been mentioned. And the thought that was running through my mind in terms of what could be done here in South Burlington, we have many opportunities to put solar on city buildings, but we are limited unless we can use the solar within the building itself. And I think I'm not sure whether it's this group or whether it's the Public Service Board or who, but if those limitations could be raised substantially, I think there might be across the state lots of opportunity to increase the solar capacity. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lou. Appreciate that comment. Wendy, I see your hands up. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I don't have my video on, but I just wanted to make a quick comment that I'm the director for NETO up in the Northeast Kingdom. And I've gone to several national conferences, and the problems that we have with our income limitations and finding the people to serve and making sure we can serve the right people, it's everywhere. If you think of what a low income federal dollar looks like, and you put that in the context of the suburbs of New York, right? There's very few people that can even, buy a cardboard box at that funding level. So if we're looking to weatherize more, I think it's important too that we do look outside the state and that we do some pushing to the federal level for the funding to open it up to allow us to serve our area median incomes. And we're going to find support for that everywhere, right? Because how much it costs to live in Vermont versus New York versus Florida versus California, right? So I don't want to lose sight of that because we do have a big gap between what the federal government provides us for funding, what they consider low income, and how much it actually costs in Vermont. So that just shouldn't be lost should the opportunity come to bring our concerns to a bigger stage. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose sight of that as well.
Thanks, Wendy. So it's about advocating for Vermont at a national level as well. Yeah. Mia.
Yeah, from a housing funder perspective, we've been sort of wrestling with the best way to think about energy efficiency and electrification in new construction. Currently, we require most of our projects to reach Efficiency Vermont's high performance building standards. But we have been really sort of nervous about going to the point of requiring buildings to be all electric. And part of that is because Efficiency Vermont is only able to incentivize performance above code, and that sort of shrinks every time we kind of get into a new code. And certainly as we're looking into the state going to net zero ready by 2030, we kind of don't really know what that's going to look like from a funding perspective. But from a housing funder perspective, kind of any dollars that we put into efficiency that's not going to be sort of reliably able to pan out over the course of a project is hard for us to ask developers to pay, and ultimately takes out of scarce housing funding resources. So I think affordable housing developers are doing more than 99% of housing developers in terms of doing really good performance buildings. But I think we're really worried about sort of that next step of full electrification. My colleague Jess put some good technical points in the chat about sort of specific challenges on like hot water and things like that. But ultimately, just kind of unsure what the next 5 years look like. And we're really pursuing Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money aggressively and hoping that's kind of a game changer to solve it from a funding perspective. But from a funder perspective, I don't think we're ready to take that next step. So. Thanks.
Thanks, Mia. Dwight?
Yeah, I just think I wanted to bring up the point that as we're talking about funding is that as our heating degree days over the last few years have lowered, and as we move more folks move to electricity as a heat source, we were seeing our state HWAP funds go down. And so we are actually losing funding for primarily those are serve the 60 to 80% folks. And what most people don't know is that the federal job cost average is just about $8,500. I don't have the number right off the top of my head. So we're having to braid in the job cost average is $15,800 to do our job nonprofit wise. So we're having to spend some of our state funds on jobs that we're considering federal just to get the complete weatherization job done in the home. And we're seeing our state funds go down because of, like I said, warmer winters, and there is some effect being made on the amount of fossil fuel being used. So we need to figure out how to maintain those levels of fundings over the year, whether that's increasing the HWAP tax or, that's the way we fund weatherizations, and that's the way we do things is through that HWAP tax. So we need to be cognizant of that and take that into consideration.
Thanks, Dwight. Sort of a paradox there. Yeah. Anne.
So I really appreciate Melissa Bailey's question, and I wish I had a good answer for that. I have done, because we've been working on the MERP program for municipal buildings, and there's really not enough money to cover all the buildings that need upgrades. I've been looking for other funding sources and finding very little. One thing which wouldn't be a big difference, but would be somewhat of a difference, is for the state to really think about how much funding it puts into planning versus implementation, to do some kind of analysis of that, because I feel like we do study after study and planning after planning, but then when it comes to implementation, there's no money there. And so that seems almost like a waste of funding, that there should be a better balance between planning and implementation. And just to be a little bit more specific, I think we spend an inordinate amount of hours on enhanced energy planning, and then don't spend any funding on implementing the enhanced energy plans that municipalities have. So that's just one comment.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah. Okay. So for folks in the task group or the subcommittee, is there any other question you'd like to pose out to this group right now before we do some exercises about key themes and what's happening? Anything else, folks on the task group, that you'd want to, test with this group? Jared?
Thanks, David. Yeah, one of the things that this conversation is making me realize and that I really appreciate is, I think, at least speaking for myself, and I think other members of the task group as well, is that we've been primarily focused on recommended actions for the state of Vermont that either, state agencies or the legislature could take. But I really appreciate, Dwight, your comments, other people's comments around federal rules. And I'm wondering, it makes me think that there may be more opportunity for us to utilize the revised climate action plan to recommend actions that we may not be able to take as a state directly through our agencies or legislature, but it is important to capture and have in a formal written plan and recommendation around, one of the big ones you mentioned, Dwight, is around the fuel assistance rules and the challenges around, if somebody moves to a heat pump, but they can only get fuel assistance for one fuel, there's a disincentive to electrify if they would lose their fuel assistance dollars for fuel oil or propane, for instance. So that's something I'm particularly really interested to hear from a lot of the practitioners on the ground, experts on this call, in terms of, I think that we're pretty light right now on recommendations that could be enshrined in this plan that we could then point federal agencies or a congressional delegation to, in terms of what Vermonters, who are delivering these programs, who have the expertise on the ground, are experiencing the challenges around those federal rules. And if we can find ways to incorporate more of that, I think that I'm certainly open to that and think that it sounds like that might be helpful. So it's just a broad question I'm working with, and would invite either comments now or feedback offline as we go forward.
Thanks, Jared. I saw some hands go up with that. Dwight, you're up first.
This is an anecdotal story, but we've had this happen to us several times. We also administer the emergency heating system grant program. And we know that when we service clients, once we service a clients once, we kind of own them for a while. And it's hard to break our clients of calling us first. But we do it gladly anyway. So we've installed cold climate heat pumps in some of these places, and it happens regularly that they call us up and they say they have no heat, and can we bring them, heaters? Well, we tell them that they have a nice big heater on their wall, and they're like, well, I don't get fuel assistance for that. I can't afford to run it. So, that happens on a regular basis. And, we do lots of education with our clients, and that still happens. So, yeah, that fuel assistance thing, and Wendy's on this call, and Jeff's on this call, and everybody else that's ever heard me speak about it. I get out my 2-box soapbox, and I managed to get to all 3 legislators in the last 2 weeks. So hopefully, or at the federal level. So hopefully they listened, and maybe they'll do something.
Thanks, Dwight. Great anecdote.
Yeah, I just want to really quickly, quickly, I think we all know that most Vermonters have primary and secondary fuel types sources in their homes, and making sure that we also consider not just in the rulemaking and then also in programs how to maintain or advocate for flexibility, but then also take that back into the way that we are collecting data, setting our baselines, and then also tracking our progress, I think is really important. And it's something that has come up and is linked really here. So I do really appreciate that. And it's one of those things where there really is a disjoint between our reality and paper. So thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Chris?
Yes, thank you. This doesn't completely address Jared's concerns with fuel subsidies. But I just want to point out that passive house standard on residential and more importantly on multifamily has now reached cost, a market cost market. So it can be delivered by developers for the same cost as a conventional project. I also want to point out that the savings to developers in electric use for such a multifamily project and on the residential and retrofit level is extreme. The certified passive houses we've built in Vermont, one to mention the Central Vermont Habitat for Humanity passive house, has an $80 a month electric bill for all electric demand, plug loads, well pump, heating and cooling, everything. So when you compare that to the amount of money a homeowner is spending on an existing home, it's pretty exceptional. This doesn't help the problem with the existing housing stock, but going forward, when we're building a new building, it's important that it be the lowest energy demand possible. And passive house retrofits and panelization, deep energy retrofits can have a great effect on energy demand as well. So I encourage you all to educate yourselves as to what the passive house standard is being applied outside of New York City, in New York City, outside of Boston, in many municipalities all around Vermont. Vermont has been first in so many things, and we're last in this kind of application of deep energy, cuts in energy demand. It's also being adopted all over the world as well. So I encourage the state to kind of look at ways that we can incentivize more multifamily passive house projects in Vermont. Okay.
Thanks, Chris.
I could go on and on
I'm
about
sure.
contractor registration,
Yeah.
and licensure, and Vermont Passive House has been working with the OPR to try to, get building science certification listed on the voluntary registry. But I want to point out that the mindful contractors throughout the state are joining that registry voluntarily, but there's probably hundreds and hundreds of contractors that don't even know what it is. We have to figure out a way to reach more people in our build community and get them on board. Okay.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate those comments. Yeah. Mark.
Hi there. I am all for the reducing the carbon and everything. I've been in the weatherization industry for probably 13 years now. I started out in the field actually weatherizing homes. Worked with a community action agency and was director for quite a few years. And now I'm with the state of Vermont and I'm an energy services program officer for the weatherization program. And first and foremost, I just want to, I'm touching base on what Mia said, to be thoughtful on the low income folks. And the weatherization program in the state of Vermont, first and foremost, is for the clients that we serve. And reducing the greenhouse gas and the carbon emissions is a side effect of us weatherizing the homes. Obviously, we make it more comfortable and healthier for the folks too. And I just want to make sure that the low income people aren't penalized if down the road, there's a higher cost for number two heating fuel or kerosene to supplement, to have that tax or income go into another direction. I just want to make sure that it's very thoughtful for these low-income homeowners, because I've been to the houses and it's almost a recipe for disaster to increase fuel prices for them if they haven't switched over. We go in and we have certain job cost averages, like Dwight said, and the cost to upgrade a whole heating system is quite a bit, when the federal is like 8,500 and the state of Vermont, the weatherization is over $15,000 job cost average. But we put most of our money into the insulation, the thermal, and the air sealing. And obviously we do some, we tune up their heating systems and make that, but it's seldom that we do a complete entire fuel switch to a new hybrid system at all. They are in between there, but it's just it wouldn't be good for the low income folks to pay higher fuel cost if that ever comes to fruition. But I just wanted to say that.
I appreciate you saying that, Mark.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the top of the hour here. I want to do two things before we finish up. One is I want to do one more exercise. There's been a lot of interesting comments and thoughtful reflections today on some topics related to what this working group's doing. I'd love if everyone can just take a moment, even if you've thrown something in the chat already. I'm going to put this link in the chat right now. This is one of these Menti polls. If anyone's used them before, just, you know the drill here. You can write a very short phrase, and I can show them as they come in. And this is what it's asking. It's asking, based on the conversation that we've just had over the last hour and 15 minutes or whatever it was, what's one piece of input that jumps out as particularly important for this subcommittee, right? So think about that. It's like this subcommittee needs to take stuff away. There's rich stuff in the chat. There's rich things of what you just said. But if you click on that link, you should be able to enter in a short phrase, and we can actually look at those together quickly. So I invite you to do that. Let me know if it's not working for some reason. I'll try to get the tech functioning. But let's just take 30 seconds or a minute to do that, and then we'll talk about the next steps in this process. Great. I can see folks doing it right now. I might even share my screen. Charlie, can you see that screen okay?
Yes.
Great. Just give it a moment here. Feel free to write something, read what others are writing. A lot about keeping the needs of low-income Vermonters front and center. Funding sources. And while we're finishing up this, Sophie, if you are able to maybe drop in the chat some information about upcoming other input sessions on other topics, maybe that content that was in that email that went out, that might be a nice way to end. Great. This is all really helpful and definitely echoing the thoughts that you all have said and you put in the chat. So I'll leave this up for a second more so you can keep reading. But as we finish up here, this is one of several input sessions that are happening on different topics that the Climate Council and subcommittees, task groups are working on. There will be more coming up. And Sophie can say a little bit more. There we go. She just dropped a link in the chat. You can see on the calendar all the different input sessions that are coming up. And if those are also topics that are of interest to you, we'd encourage you to join, and we get into some of the other details of the content. To give folks a sense of, oh, oops, here's more stuff coming in. To give folks a sense of next steps with the council, the council subcommittees are scheduled in December to provide their recommendations on these big topic areas, whether it's these kinds of areas around reducing emissions. There's also around resilience, and there's a whole area around ag and agriculture and ecosystems. So those will come up to the council in December. And then over the winter, the council, with the help from Vermont's Climate Action Office, will be consolidating that into a draft plan. You can expect that a draft plan will be ready for some public comment by April, more or less. And then the council will be reviewing that comment in the spring and getting ready to meet its statutory requirement of an updated climate action plan by July 1st. So that's the timeline that's happening. And along that timeline, there will be some input sessions like this. And in April, for sure, there'll be a number of things around the draft plan. So stay tuned for that. Sophie, the other thing to drop in the chat is how to get on the mailing list for the Climate Action Office, which helps with the Climate Council work as well. Okay. I think that's it. Last word maybe goes to the subcommittee folks and the task group folks who put together this presentation. Anything else you want to say, whether that's Dave, Sam, Jared, Ben, anything else you'd like to say as we finish up?
Well, just on behalf of all the folks putting this together, thank you so much for these comments. Lots of wonderful comments. We will get back to thinking about them. Really helpful comments. Thank you all so much.
Yep. We'll be synthesizing those comments down, helping the task group digest them. Have a great day. Rest of your afternoon, everybody. Take care. Thanks for being here today with us.